why don't we, since we're about 4 minutes away, let's just do a very quick round of introductions so that you guys know what you're in for and kind of like
We promise
set
we're not
your
a bunch of
expectations.
assholes who just bullied our way into having a panel.
Yeah, so my name is Alex Abdullayev. I have a degree of some sort, I don't know, but I teach at Westchester University. So I'm at the Wells School of Music. My specialty is musicology. I did my degree on like 1920s to 1950s jazz, but recently I've started branching out a little bit more into musical semiotics and things of that nature, where I look at music and say like, okay, what does this mean? How do we interpret this? How does that communicate information to us? And so on and so forth. And this person over here is my wife, Caitlin.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Farthing. I'm an art historian and restorer / conservator. My specialty in conservation is books, but my specialty in art history and art, sort of the study of art, is two things. I really love applying fine art theory to things that are not traditionally considered fine art, like video games and comic books, and I love researching sort of the ways that we tell each other things without verbally saying them. So all of the ways that video games give you information in the design, in what you're looking at, that they cannot have a character just info dump at you.
Yes.
If you've ever read the book Understanding Comics, that's basically my jam.
It is a really good book. One thing that I want to mention is that I know that many of you may be here because the panel was advertised as talking about Dragon Age Origins, Nier, Automata, and Witcher 3. Unfortunately, as these things tend to go, sometimes in the process of writing these panels, you start talking about a thing and you're like, oh, actually, I would like to talk about this other thing that I could tell a little bit more about. So The Witcher 3 will not actually be on the list of games we're going to talk about. I've instead elected to talk about an older game called Star Wars TIE Fighter, which I think is going to be a little bit easier to discuss within the framework of what this lecture is about, and also for a variety of reasons. I think Star Wars is a little bit more culturally ingrained in our zeitgeist that we can probably just skip the very lengthy introduction and conversation about what that means. Just a quick disclaimer. I had a hell of a long day today. So if for some reason I start like not making sense, feel free to ask me questions afterwards. I do have a little bit of time after this panel, so if for whatever reason anything I say is unclear, or if you would like an additional clarification on any part of the topic that we're discussing, or you just want to kind of argue with me about anything I say, which is totally fine. I'm not an expert on absolutely everything. I too can make mistakes. So if you want to, say something about anything I said, just, come on up, grab a microphone. We're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end of this lecture for questions. So, yeah.
Yes. This is an important thing about academia. Everyone who is presenting anything in academia is someone who's just noticed something and wants to talk about it. There are gaps in our knowledge. We may not know something. This is just our observations and our opinions.
Yeah. So.
We are right, though.
There's a reason they put us up here, right? Is that because they're like, well, clearly these people sound like they know what they're talking about. At the very least, they look like they know what they're talking about. And I'm like, yes, fooled them. Here is the plan for today. We're going to start talking about like why video game music matters. We're all obviously here because we kind of, in one way, shape, or form or another, are somehow attached to the idea of video game music and want to know more about it. We're going to discuss a little bit about terminology and criteria. And one of the things that I definitely want to kind of cover is that this isn't going to be a primer on, yes?
Before we get too far, someone in the back, can you hear us clearly? Thank you.
Brilliant. If for some reason you can't, just yell at me and I'll talk more into the microphone. So we're going to discuss some of the terminology and criteria, and yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, that'll be great. I generally don't have that problem. I just kind of do the Zach De La Rocha thing where I just put my entire mouth on the microphone. Like, okay, blank stares. Rage Against the Machine. Okay, great. Now we're on the same page. Cool. So we're going to go over some of the elements of analysis, and then we're going to dive into 3 examples. The first of these is going to be Val Royeau from Dragon Age Inquisition 2014 by Trevor Morris. Then we're going to talk about the opening to TIE Fighter, John Williams, Clint Bajekian, Michael Land, orchestrated by Alexei Savelyev. And then we're going to talk about Memories of Dust by Keiichi Okabe from Nier Automata. Okay, great. Let's dive in. So why does video game music matter? Well, I mean, clearly you are all here because you enjoy music and games, right? At some point or another, every single person in this room has played some sort of electronic game, whether it's a Mr. Game & Watch or if it's like, you know, an
Candy
NES
Crush.
console, Candy Crush, if you've played like a console or a PC game, whatever, you probably understand that there is a musical or an audio component to it. Now, the interesting thing about music in video games is it works very differently than music in film. Cinematic music tends to default to a state of accompanying the action or somehow semaphoring the action. Music in video games is a little bit more active, but at the same time, it has that burden of being less involved in the process. It's supposed to exist within the diegesis of the soundtrack, but without becoming obtrusive. So you're not supposed to treat it as a thing that's apart from the action. It is a thing that supports the action. It kind of moves it along, but it's not necessarily intended to be a separate thing that you're just going to pause the game and listen to, unless it's, you know, something like Disco Elysium, which is a perfect game, 10 out of 10. Don't at me. We can talk about Disco Elysium another time. So how do we interact with video game music? Well, first and foremost, the video game music does a bunch of different things. It sets the tone for the thing that we're playing. It tells us what to do. It subtly communicates the seriousness or the joviality of the narrative, but it also just kind of makes us do the thing. At the end of the day, every element of the game is intended to get us more engaged with the haptics of the game. It's intended to get us more engaged with the mechanics of it, and it needs us to proceed further according to what the game design actually wants us to do.
We've all felt the panic of the fight music start.
Exactly, yeah. So, perfect example of this is the first level of Super Mario Brothers. So what I would like to do is I'd like to play this for you, and then I'm just going to ask you guys some very basic questions about it. Perfect. Okay, pause right there. So what does the music tell us about what we're doing here? Okay, sure. Yeah. It interacts with the actions you're doing, right? There's also like, you know, when you pick up a flower, when you pick up a mushroom, when you die, like, right? Like that same thing we're always familiar with, like, right? What else? Yeah, absolutely. It tells and communicates the tone of the game.
A bright, poppy, fun song for a bright, poppy, cartoony, fun world.
Yeah.
Where you die.
Cool. Yeah. It sets the pacing of the game to some extent.
You can't move slow to that music.
Yeah, it creates an energy, absolutely, right? So like you see, even without getting into the particulars, into the analytical bits of it, like what the notes are, we can already understand some of the ideas behind what this music does. Let's do that again, but this time we're going to silence the music. And let's see if we can figure out some ways in which this is different now.
I'm hearing it.
Yeah.
Right? Right. So this is an exercise I also like doing with my Music Appreciation 101 students, where I play them a Marvel movie, and I just take the soundtrack out, right? And then they're like, wow, this is really sad. I'm like, I know.
Yeah. So,
The music really tells you exactly how to feel about the scene.
so what are we feeling after watching that? How do we feel about Mario now? It's creepy and it's stressful.
Yeah.
Has anyone? Sorry, what?
I was saying that it feels like you turn the volume off because you're playing while your parents are.
Yes, because Dad's
Sure.
gonna yell at you if he hears that game one more time.
Yeah.
Has anyone here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Has anyone here seen Buffy?
Buffy
Has
the
anyone
Vampire
seen
Slayer?
the episode of spoilers? Has anyone seen the episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer where her mom dies? and there is absolutely no music the entire episode, and it is creepy and unsettling.
Yeah, I think that episode is called Hush.
Yes. It might have been, yeah. So that's the sort of thing we're dealing with, because we're so used to hearing music in the background of everything we do on a screen. When it's taken away, it's stressful and unnerving, and we don't really know how to feel.
Yeah. So it makes for a very different experience when that component that we kind of took for granted this entire is yoinked away from us. We're no longer really focusing on the presence of the sound, right? We're focusing on the absence of the sound. So music tells us a lot. So in other words, what I would like to do for this panel is begin this discussion by talking about the 8 elements of music, which is like, it's going to be some pretty fundamental stuff for most of you. If you've had any musical training, you've probably run into these things.
If anyone suffered through AP Music Theory, I'm sorry to bring back your trauma.
Yeah. I'm sorry to be the cause of that trauma. No. I feel your pain. I truly do. I teach music appreciation, among other things, and it's like I just started defaulting to being like, okay, let's just have an open conversation about this thing instead of asking pointed questions, because it's like, why? Okay, so let's very quickly run down the 3 essential things, and then the 5 like sort of secondary things. So the first 3 elements that we really need to focus on are melody, which is that thing that you hum. The harmony, which is the thing that you play along on the guitar with as you hum the song.
It's the thing that makes it sound pretty.
Yeah, and the rhythm, which is the thing you tap your foot to, right? It gets more complicated than that, obviously, but given that this is only a 1-hour panel and not a 1-semester-long college course, I am gonna fast forward through some of this stuff. The next 3 things are texture, timbre, and form. So texture is basically how many layers are there to the music. What are those layers? Are they played by different instruments? And how do they interact? Timbre is the tone quality of the music. So it's like...
If you've ever taken a singing class, you've heard so much about timbre, it's painful.
Yeah, yeah. And it's by the way, no matter what Thoughty 2 says, it's not timbre, it's timbre. So it's a French word. So the definition of timbre is basically tone color, right? It's whether something sounds bright, like or if something sounds very opaque, right? So it's the discrepancy between how instruments sound. And then form is essentially the roadmap for the piece of music. It's where we start, where we go to, and where we end up. And the last 2 things are tonality and dynamics. Those are a little less essential. Dynamics is basically loud and soft, how loud a piece of music goes, how soft it gets. Tonality is whether the piece is in a major key, happy, or if it's in a minor key, sad. Of course, I will once again put an asterisk next to that and say that this is a very short primer of what we think about when we're talking about music analysis. But if you want to screenshot this and reference this for later, you are certainly welcome to do this. So you're not completely out to lunch if I say like, yes, the form of this piece, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, the fuck is that? Oh, fun fact, I will say the fuck word a lot. So, if you're offended by that,
now is not the time.
Sorry. No, but seriously, like if it bothers you, like, I apologize. Okay, great. So let's talk about what analysis is. So in the context of anything, analysis is essentially looking at something and going beyond the text meaning. So we have several different layers. Text is basically the most superficial. It is exactly what the thing tells you, right? So if you're reading a book, it is the literal meaning of the words. Below that, we have subtext, which is the hidden meaning, right? So like, for instance, if you're reading Lord of the Rings, some people say that it might have been an allegory for Europe in wartime. It might have been an allegory for humanity. It might have been a variety of different things. Tolkien himself never really was explicit about it, but it's the reading into the meaning of the text. So that's the subtext. Beyond that, we have context, which are the things that are happening around the time. Like, for instance, Lord of the Rings was written around the time of World War I, so clearly it must have been colored by some of those ideas. It was also colored by the ideas of British colonialism and the British Raj and things like that. So there's ideas
also
of othering in there.
The many things that Tolkien referenced, like Norse mythology, the King Arthur mythos, all of that plays a part.
Absolutely. And then beneath that, we have the meta text, which is what kind of references that thing that we're looking at is making to other texts and their context and subtexts. There's also the thing called paratext. Paratext is basically like the wrapping, like the essentially the box that the text comes in, which isn't part of the text, but it is adjacent to the text. So when we're dealing with analysis, essentially, we have three different layers of analytical technique. The first is the theoretical or authorial analysis. It is literally just looking at the thing and saying, like, these are the facts. It's it's what we call the empirical analysis of things. So we're looking at a piece of music, we're looking at the way the notes are stacked up vertically and horizontally, what chords they form, and how they interact with each other. Beneath that, we have the contextual analysis. So we're actually looking at what that music tells us. And beyond that, there's a biblical term called exegesis, which is where you look at a biblical verse and you really try to understand what it's telling you about, like, morality, about the greater world, and that's exegesic analysis. So we're going to try to apply a little bit of each to every piece of music that we're going to be looking at here. I want to stipulate that I'm going to be using a lot of technical jargon, so if you want, you can let it wash over you. You don't need to understand music theory to get it. I will try to couch it in as simple a terminology as possible, but if you want a more complete explanation, come find me after the panel. I'm happy to, like, give you a better rundown of what I'm about to talk to. So what is the best way to infer meaning from context? Well, the thing that we're really kind of always coming back to is media literacy, right? There's a video that James Somerton recently put out about Attack on Titan and how many people misunderstand it as an allegory for the author being essentially a racist. And he admits that that may be true to some extent. However, what it also implies is that you're looking purely at the textual significance of the show. You're not going beyond that into the wider context and looking at it from a more bird's eye view. So really understanding the greater connections between different media and understanding how they interrelate one to another is at the core of what the best way to infer meaning from anything is, right? Because if you are looking at Lord of the Rings, yet again, you kind of have to be familiar with Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Names. And if you're looking at A Hero with a Thousand Names, well, you also have to be familiar with not just the theoretical writings, but also the writings that that theory is derived from, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, any number of other epics, right? And the same thing is true with music, and particularly with video game music. Every piece of video game music is built on top of something else.
Artists constantly steal from each other. Constantly. They take little tiny bits and they build on top of it, and that's what makes new art.
And it's not even exclusively just stealing. There's a finite number of combinations of pitches in the universe. So we can only stack them so many times. So sooner or later, something is going to be referencing something else.
There's also, in our culture, we associate certain things with certain things. We associate big fancy orchestras with giant fancy ballrooms. We associate lots of trumpets and horns with jazz music.
Or military.
Yes, with military. We associate certain sounds with certain things. If you put a sound that we do not associate with that thing, it's not going to make sense and your audience is going to be confused. You are sort of limited by the sort of cultural zeitgeist you're working within.
Good. So, before we dive in, any questions?
Yes, person at the back.
Okay, so yeah, we have a whole tunnel right. So you say, like, when it comes to, like, certain sounds, it's like, okay, yeah, like, you'll have, like, certain sounds, like, you know, like, orchestra, kind of related to, what's it called, like, you know, like, kind of more into, like, say, like, stereotypical classical. But what if we have, like, something like we have, like, orchestra, and then you combine it into, like, you know, like, with electric guitars, like, something that's, like, super, like, with two sounds that sound, like, super cohesive?
Fantastic question. I love these questions because they are kind of taking me to task about this.
So for anyone who didn't hear, it's asking about, so, like, you know, an orchestra has certain connotations. What happens when you combine, like, an orchestra with, like, an electric guitar? Something that is not associated or, like, contextually put together with an orchestra very often.
So there is a cinematic term for this, and I think that cinematic terminology is also kind of applicable to video game language. The idea of affinity and contrast. So affinity is something when two things are very similar, right? So, like, for instance, if you have a violin combined with a harp, the sound of those two instruments is very complementary, so they create a kind of affinity. Or, like, for instance, when you have complementary colors on screen, like, for instance, orange and yellow, right? You're going to have colors in the same color family, they're going to create a certain affinity. Contrast is when you have opposites, like, for instance, red and black, or, like, red and blue. In music, when you have certain sounds that are, like, from two opposing families, like, for instance, you know, a flute and, like, I don't know, a musical saw or something like that, right? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it's been done. So that creates a certain jarring feeling to it. And so if it happens, you have to start asking questions. Why? Why does this happen? What is the purpose of the composer doing this? Because let's go ahead and put a pin in this one, because this is a really important thing. Most artists never do things on accident. A good composer or a filmmaker or a game director or a painter will always do something with intent, and that intent is going to somehow reflect something that they are trying to say with their art.
Particularly when it comes to video games, because especially with animation, it takes so long to make this. Everything on screen is at least vaguely intentional and has been through many committees. You're not going to get a Starbucks coffee cup on a medieval table by accident. It's supposed to be there.
Yeah, and I would actually extend that further by saying that art is not accidental. Art is a very meticulous process, and we have to kind of understand on faith to some extent that artists go through years and years of rigorous training to be good at the thing that they're intended to do. So when they do something that is deliberately jarring or sounds like it's offending your ear, we don't have to turn our nose away at it. But I mean, you're certainly well within your right to do this. But before we do that, it's always prudent to ask, why are they doing this? You see, what is the intent behind it, and what are they attempting to elicit from us as a response to that? So,
Yeah.
okay, perfect. Is that a satisfactory answer? Great, perfect.
All right,
Okay, very good. Let's go ahead and forge ahead. So the first piece we're going to talk about is Val Royeaux from Dragon Age Inquisition by
My
Trevor
favorite
Morris.
game.
So Kate is our resident Dragon Age expert.
When this panel happened, I was like, I'm not going to have anything to talk about. And then I saw that Dragon Age was on there and went, oh, great. We'll make sure this isn't the entire panel. So Dragon Age is my favorite game. I love this game because it combines so many interesting aesthetics. Because Dragon Age starts with the traditional grimdark fantasy aesthetic. It's in the music, it's in that big, swelling, beautiful orchestra that appears as soon as you look up in the sky at the giant green hole, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna be the hero, because Trevor Morris is really, really, really good at heroic anthems. Absolutely fantastic, and it is a genuine shame he's not returning for Dragon Age Dreadwolf. I'm excited about Hans Zimmer, but Trevor Morris did such a good job with Inquisition, and I'm very sad to see him
I'm not excited about Hans Zimmer. I'm sorry, I'm anti Hans Zimmer.
So we start
At me in the comments.
Ooh, okay. We're just slandering composers now. So when we start with Dragon Age, we're in, like I said, the grimdark medieval fantasy aesthetic. This idea of what we think usually medieval England looked like. Castles, stonework, wooden huts, lots of trees, very pretty. But then we get to Val Royeaux. And Val Royeaux is very interesting because Val Royeaux is not even remotely medieval. Not even a little bit. It is almost exclusively French Rococo. We are talking like hundreds of years past medieval, but they still make it work within the aesthetic of the game because they include just a tiny bit of Renaissance aesthetics, which came right after medieval, and a lot of what we associate with medieval aesthetic is actually Renaissance aesthetic, but that's a separate panel.
Tell us about the panel that we're going to be doing next year, Kate.
I tried to write a panel about that, about the medieval aesthetic in video games, and they told me no. They told
It's
me
okay.
I couldn't have it.
No. Hold on. We're not throwing shade here.
No.
We're not. No. I'm not. I'm saying that, look, there's hundreds of people applying for panels, and
Yes, that is true.
timing is limited. So sometimes I understand that
We
certain
can't
things
do
have to
every panel ever. That's not allowed.
Also, like this would have been our fourth panel this weekend. That is a lot.
Yeah. So when we're talking about Val Royeaux, we're going from this very medieval aesthetic into this very Rococo aesthetic. And if you've ever interacted with Rococo, think Versailles. Think gilded, golden, beautiful, shining, the bright blue paint. Does anyone know where that blue paint comes from? No, that's purple. Purple was the seashells. Blue paint comes at the time of the Middle Ages from a very, very expensive stone known as lapis lazuli. If you buy lapis lazuli now, it is $10,000 a pound. I have worked with it once. I was terrified the entire time. It is incredibly expensive to get that bright blue, like Virgin Mary royal blue. So the fact that Val Royeaux is covered in this, the fact that Empress Celine is covered in this, is just a sign to how opulent and extravagant and just over-the-top wealthy Val Royeaux wants you to believe that it is. And so when you walk in there, all you see is fancy and finery, and the music matches it, if you want to start playing the music.
Well, let's talk about the way that, let's talk a little bit more about the way that this environment is communicated through clothing.
Yes. So if you notice, if you're walking around Ferelden in Dragon Age Inquisition, everyone looks poor. Literally everyone. Everyone is in brown pants and like a shirt and a vest. No one looks fancy. Even when you meet like Queen Honora, she looks very almost like
Plain?
Éowyn almost in Lord of the Rings, which is also very medieval inspired. It's not super fancy. If any of you mod Dragon Age, there's a great mod called the Arlessa's Wardrobe, and it's supposed to be like the fanciest clothing in Ferelden, and the fanciest thing about it is that there's fur on it. That's it. And so you're used to Ferelden at this point, because pretty much all you've done is walk through the hinterlands over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So you get in here, and everyone's in silk. They've taken extensive care to show you silk, to show you velvet, to show you metallics, which are, if you don't know, metallics are incredibly difficult to animate. Beautiful fabrics are incredibly difficult to get the right sheen on in animation. They spent forever building up this aesthetic, particularly here, of just a gorgeous, beautiful, opulent city with gorgeous, beautiful, opulent people. But there is a reason everyone's wearing a mask. It's beautiful, but it's there for a reason. And this is semaphore beautifully in the music.
What's the reason they're wearing a mask?
Because they're gonna kill you.
Oh, okay.
Because they want to hurt you and they don't want you to know who they are.
Right on. Okay, so let's talk about the actual piece. I'm going to go ahead and play it. Do some associations for this one. Think about what it brings to mind.
First of all, no one uses a cello like Trevor Morris.
I know.
It's so good.
Cello is the best instrument ever. I play piano. I have always regretted not being a cellist because, Yo-Yo Ma, come
I
on.
used to play it once upon a time back in the world.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, all right, let me hand this over to you guys for just a very brief moment. Let's do some observation association. What did you notice? Like, what kind of things did you catch about this music?
Guy with the glasses and the mask, first.
Yes. Hi.
First thing I noticed is like the 1, 2.
Yeah, the waltz.
Brilliant.
Because what do we associate that time signature with?
Let's hold off on that for now. Let's just go ahead and get everybody out here. Yes, Rosie, please. And
Think of ballroom dancing.
Yeah.
Opulence.
perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah, you in the brown jacket
Yes.
with the glasses.
Yes.
Light use of percussion.
Great. Light use of percussion. Fantastic. Let's keep going.
Pink sweater.
Uh-huh.
It was very beautiful, but also had this like urgency.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Absolutely.
Person with the white gloves and the blue dress.
The 2 words that he was learning from me were grandiose and dangerous.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Absolutely. You guys are right on the money with this. Let's keep going. Go ahead.
The sort of middle section was kind of tense and vaguely threatening.
Yeah.
Tense and vaguely threatening. I completely agree. Let's keep going.
Fairy.
It's adventure music.
Yes.
Adventure music.
No one does a hero theme like Trevor Morris.
Quite right.
Like a rogue quartet type of
Yes.
feel, immediately goes into something happened that I can see that has got moved the character along.
Great. Yeah, fantastic. Let's do like one more or two
Guy
more.
in the red
yeah.
shirt, because you've had your hand raised for a
I was
second.
gonna say it moves from
wonderment to adventure to conquest or conclusion.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please.
All I was going to say is that you mentioned the ABA structure, so it's like
Yeah.
at the beginning you have the opulence, in the B section you know something's wrong, and then you go back to A, but the tone is also different. It's almost like you realize something.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so, I mean, you guys are kind of doing a lot of legwork for us, but what I would like to do is kind of concatenate a lot of that and like, make it a little bit more cohesive. So the first thing that we usually tend to look at is the big structural stuff. I'm going to avoid bringing Heinrich Schenker into this because it's weird. But it's good to look at music in broad strokes. So we're going to start with the form. The form is a ternary form. So what that means is that we begin with an A section, then a contrasting B section, and then in the finale, we bring back material from the A section. So it has a very bookended structure. So it goes from stuff to new stuff to familiar stuff. Now, the A and the B section are usually contrasting in a variety of ways. We're going to have something that is maybe contrasted in tonality, right, which is like happy versus sad, or much more placid versus something more urgent. You can also have a contrast in the simpler elements, like for instance, melody or harmony or rhythm. And in this case, this is actually what's happening. So we're having a rhythmic change. We're going from a very stable 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, to what's called an ostinato, which is a repeated rhythm. Now, this ostinato itself is also kind of a weird thing because what it does is it puts the accents on the weak beats. In music, this is called syncopation. So one big piece that does this to create a sense of urgency is a piece you've all heard of to some extent or another, The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, right? Dun 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 dun, right? And the whole point of that, the Augurs of Spring, is to create this sense of urgency, of danger, of otherness, right? So, okay. So what? Big deal. Lots of pieces are written in ABA. That tells us nothing. Well, let's look more structurally. I have taken the liberty of writing this whole thing out for you. You're welcome. Now, this isn't the entire structure, because obviously I'm omitting a lot of details. This is just the skeleton for this. For those of you who read music, this is the A section of this piece. So let's take a look at what's going on. So this one is in 3/4. We're essentially keeping things very steady rhythmically. Harmonically, this piece is a little all over the place. So we start in the key of D minor, right? We're kind of keeping to that up until the 4th measure, which is usually pretty standard. That is your first phrase. 4 bars is generally a phrase. Then it starts getting weird. We're going to B flat, C, and F, which is kind of a very standard 4-5-1 progression that leads us into a different key of A7. So that circles us back around. Now, if you look at the melody, it's actually pretty standard. Dun, 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 right? And then we have a second contrasting part. Yes?
No, keep going. Talk.
Okay, right. So then that whole thing is repeated with a slightly different twist on that. So we're going to this high key right there with the B flat, C, F. So this is our culmination. This is our climax of this piece. This is incidentally also where we have to talk about instrumentations, because throughout this entire section we have strings and harpsichord. Okay. What does harpsichord mean in the context of music? Well, okay, so first of all, it's an instrument that's representative of the Baroque, but it also represents high class, high society. So this is already kind of written into the DNA of the music for you. As you're listening to it, it becomes really apparent that this is intended to be a high class city. So by the time you get over here, you'll also hear that Trevor Morris adds a very epic choral lick, right? So he creates this elevated state of, not tension, but he creates this like feeling of opulence by adding this enlarged texture to this. And then of course we go into the B section, which is kind of its own thing. I didn't write that out. But the point is that all the information you need to understand what exactly Valroyo is written into the music. And you guys picked up on it beautifully, right? It's just that the details are also just as important. as you're figuring these things out, as you're kind of making the connections, like, oh, this sounds like adventure music, this sounds like high class royalty music.
This sounds very, very dangerous.
Right.
Because if you've played the game, you know that Val Royeaux is where all of the intrigue happens. People are literally getting stabbed in the night, every night. No one really cares. You walk into a fancy party and a dude is frozen and you have the choice to kill him or let him go, and no one cares.
Yeah.
It's a land of, they call it the game.
Right.
And everyone is a victim of the game at some point.
Yeah. And so you have this contrast between this grand opulence and this dangerous music that's happening in the B section, which then comes back to the opulence in the A section. So, like, you guys picked up on it. But it's the details that matter, right? The fact that he's introducing a harpsichord, the fact that there is a choir there, the fact that there's all of these little bits and pieces. So all of this contributes to us kind of subconsciously getting it. And the thing is that you've all heard this before. Like, I noticed all of you were nodding along when I said, like, oh, it's the rite of spring, basically, right here. Right? You guys all like, oh, yeah, that makes
We
sense.
have all heard very similar things every time there's a fancy ballroom in the show.
And so what the composer does in this framework is they basically take things that we already know, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, and just plug them into these pieces of music where they basically do exactly what they're meant to do. Is they create wordless associations for us, right? Okay. Before I move on, anybody have any questions? Anybody want me to expand anything? Yes, let's do like one in the back and one here in the front.
So you mentioned that they had the harp, and I noticed that it was actually pretty muted compared to the swelling string.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason? Because when you think of Baroque music, the
Sure.
harpsichord is front and center.
Right.
And this instrumentation voice, it was a lot more
Right.
kind of underneath the strings of something.
For anyone who couldn't hear, it's asking about, with the harpsichord being such a big deal that we mentioned, it's very muted in comparison to the other instruments, which is interesting because we always associate the harpsichord with the Baroque.
I honestly, I would disagree that the harpsichord is front and center in Baroque music. So in Baroque chamber music, it is the backbone. So the harpsichord serves two functions. It provides the rhythm, and it provides the structure, the harmonic underpinning for it. It's really meant to be there as an afterthought. It's meant to be improvised. It's never intended to be in the front of the ensemble
like the
unless it's a
xylophone in the marching
soloist.
band.
Yeah, exactly. In jazz music, it was simply replaced by the rhythm trio, so like the bass, the piano, and the drums. So it's not really meant to be perceived unless it's soloing.
Person in the red shirt.
So one thing that sometimes, like, we've done this analysis with the beat, we listen to it from beginning to end.
Sure.
The input portion is looped.
Yes. I was just about to point that out. So
If you listen to it in this ABA structure, assuming all of the segments are equal length roughly, like, obviously, do you feel like there's some intention behind
Yes.
like putting like the B section having less time overall in your ear?
Yes, absolutely. So notice that I'm just going to play this real quick. So we begin this piece in the key of D, right? So let's go ahead and just, shoot, sorry guys, I apologize. So anyway, so we start here in the key of D, fine. Right time to get here. We're in the key of G, but notice where it transitions at the end. It ends on the 5 of G, which is the D. So that's the point at which the music is going to loop back around and start from the beginning. This is actually something very common. This is a trick that, I forget the name of the composer, but the guy who wrote the soundtracks to Rebel Cops does. This is also the same thing Disco Elysium music does, is because it's meant to be constantly looping into other tracks. Every track has to end on something that lets you loop into the next one. So this is a very common device that video game composers use to create continuity and contiguousness between musical examples. Okay, great. Let's press on, why don't we? So, I mean, I could talk about this for a lot more.
We could talk about Dragon Age
I do
forever,
want
but we
to.
can't.
I do want to move ahead. So let's.
I would love to, but I can't.
So rather than talking about Witcher 3, as I mentioned earlier, I decided that I was going to talk about TIE Fighter, because TIE Fighter is also a very good game. It's also extremely nuanced. I think it stands as a particularly fascinating edifice in the world of video games. It's also like an older game, so this might kind of shed some new light. And also Star Wars is very much at the forefront of our zeitgeist, given that it has been repicked up by Disney. So the thing that I want to talk about here is this concept of reification, not reification. That's a different thing. That's what Disney's doing to Star Wars right now. Just kick me out of this room already. Okay. But reification is a term that comes to us from a variety of different sources, including Marxist philosophy, including economics, and including linguistics. So basically, it is the idea that a thing is a stand-in for the entirety of the thing. So it's kind of, in that sense, kind of like using a part as a stand-in for a whole, which is, one of the reasons that people usually get upset when we burn an American flag. It's like the flag is not the country, but what it represents is the country. Through a variety of different symbols and semiotics, we associate the small part with the big part. And similarly, as we look at a globe, the map of the world, we notice that the countries on the map are not the same thing as countries in real life, but we kind of associate them with the idea of like, this is France, this is Spain, whatever. So Star Wars works very much the same way. We have a lot of motifs, they're called leitmotifs, that represent different things. Like for instance, the opening strains are usually considered to be the overture. They're also the Force, they're the Star Wars motif, they're the Rebellion motif, and to some extent, they're also the Luke Skywalker motif. The Imperial March can be the Imperial March or the Darth Vader theme. So we have certain expectations from this music. We understand what it means through years and years and years and years of layered experience with this franchise.
Literally everyone knows, oh, that's Luke's theme. Oh, that's Obi-Wan's theme.
So what's interesting about TIE Fighter, just kind of like to divert into this territory, because this is important context. TIE Fighter is the sequel to X-Wing, which was basically a retelling of A New Hope from the cockpit of an X-Wing. TIE Fighter puts you in the cockpit of a TIE Fighter, and it forces you to be an Imperial pilot for the entirety of the game. At no point do you leave the Empire. Now, there is a civil war in the Empire. There is also the emergence of the secret order of the Emperor, which is attempting to like root out sedition in the Empire. And also the whole point of the game is that you are essentially flying for the bad guys, but the philosophy of the bad guys is reversed. They don't think of themselves as the bad guys. They think of themselves as bringing the necessary order to the galaxy that it so sorely lacks, but it's diplomacy at the end of a loaded gun, right? So they're not giving planets a choice to decline, right? It's an offer that they fundamentally cannot refuse. So here's what the music does. Let me go ahead and play for you the entirety of the opening for this.
That is not where you expected this to go.
It gets better, just listen. Pause. Okay, sorry. I know this is great music. I can listen to it all the time, but like we gotta keep moving. So there was an audible gasp where it didn't go when you expected it to go. You're like, oh yeah, no, we totally know where this is going. Wait, what?
Yeah,
right? Like,
who
okay.
actually anticipated the Imperial March popping in there?
So I love playing this for my students because it's the same exact reaction every time. They're like, wait, that's not how that goes, right? Because we expect it to go a certain way. So
We've
it's
been
already
raised from seeing these movies basically from birth for most of us, for a good number of people in this room. It goes a certain way. Right. That's where the song goes. And suddenly, no, that's not where it goes.
So I'm not going to necessarily discuss the subtleties of the Imperial March here. The Imperial March is a well-researched, well-discussed piece of music if you want to look at research about like what it means, about all the militaristic elements to it, about all of the chromatics that are incorporated in this. You're welcome to look up any number of YouTube videos that discuss this. That's not really what I'm here for. Here's what I'm here for. I'm here for that second part where it gets really weird, right? So after the Imperial March theme, this part right here. So it takes on a surprisingly hymn-like quality. For those of you who have played video games or have watched movies, this will sound very familiar. It sounds like the United Earth Directorate hymn from StarCraft. It sounds like the hymn of the Federation from Starship Troopers. It carries that same nobility that's associated with most political music, right? Particularly political propaganda music. But here's what's really interesting about it. Listen to this again. Oh, shit. Sorry, guys. I suck at this. This is where it gets wacky. So it goes through what's called a modified circle of fifths, without boring you with the explanation. Pitches are usually related, and they're typically related at the interval of a fifth. So C will generally go to G, G will go to D, D will go to A, and so on and so forth. So like they're jumping up by intervals of a fifth. This is going in the opposite direction. It's a descending circle of fifths that goes. It starts with kind of like a G flat to an E flat kind of tonality. Then it goes to A flat. Then it jumps down to D flat, G flat, C, and F. So it's a slightly modified circle fifth, but it creates this descending feeling, right, in the harmonics. Circles of fifths are weird because they're technically chromatic, and chromatics are very subversive. They don't stay in one place. They shift, right? And so because this game is dealing with shifting allegiances and kind of subterfuge, that is baked into the soundtrack here. And also, take a look at this final fanfare here. This is my favorite shit right here. Anybody here with particularly keen ears able to identify what that interval is? Dun, 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 the harmonics there. Sorry? You're absolutely right. It is a tritone. Gold star to you. Yes. You know what? It's paying off. It's paying off finally. MAGFest 2023.
You get an A+
This
in
is
the
your
panel.
day. Okay, good. Now, here's bonus question, bonus round for you. My friend, what is the connotation or the meaning of a tritone? It is extremely uncomfortable. Back in the Middle Ages, they used to refer to that shit as the devil's fourth. Okay, so the tritone is probably one of the most dissonant intervals in the scale.
It makes you feel icky in your brain.
Right, so listen to this one more time. So we have this transition down.
It doesn't sound right.
It's menacing as hell.
It's scary.
Right? So like they contrast three things. The Imperial March, which you already know, but it comes out of nowhere, and you're like, what the fuck is that doing here, right? We're supposed to, right? Like, okay, cool. But then they give you this beautiful hymn-like tune that kind of starts going places, and then they cap it off with this fanfare with the tritone, and you're just kind of, okay, what?
Are we the baddies?
Yeah, are we the baddies, right? So now my other favorite thing is right there at the end. So this is the actual Imperial Navy hymn. Oh, shit. Okay,
It does not like you today. YouTube is just mad at you right now.
I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this.
It sounds like the part where you're on the docks in Treasure Planet.
Yeah, it's heroic. That leitmotif in the context of this of the soundtrack of this game is called the Imperial Navy March. Notice this is different from the Imperial March, right? So this is the Imperial Navy hymn. It's very heroic. And so it's this duality of like menace and heroism is something that's dominant in this game. And I highly, highly recommend that you either watch a playthrough of this game if you're interested in it, or just read a synopsis because it's one of the most fascinating pieces of Star Wars like Legends lore that I have looked at in gaming. So yes, please. It's on PC. You can actually get it on GOG.com. I think it's also on Steam. Yeah. The soundtracks are janky, but they'll get you through. I mean, it doesn't sound this good. This is a reorchestration by Alexei Savelyev. Yeah, okay, great. Let's
Moving
press on.
on to our last thing.
The last thing I want to talk about is probably one of my favorite games, and that is Nier Automata. Nier is a strange, strange beast.
Beautiful and weird, and it puts you to sleep while making you cry, while making you laugh at the same time.
For those of you who don't know, Nier games are the sequels to a hidden non-canon ending to the game Drakengard 2, which wasn't really even intended to be in it. But Yoko Taro, being the mad, insane beast of a man, was like, hey guys, I got an idea. Let's make a game out of that shit. So, for those of you who don't know, the game itself borrows from lots and lots of sources, primarily from Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian cinematographer. So this is apparent both in the contrast between the black and white and the color as you go down to Earth, but also in the way that first world is designed. It's lush, verdant greenery contrasted with like decrepit machines, which is basically the entire second half of Stalker. The music is similarly used in a very minimalist and very pointillistic approach. The music itself was composed by Keiichi Okabe with his Monica Ensemble, who is probably the only person on Earth who is more clinically insane than Yoko Taro. No, I mean, like, the man is brilliant. He's an absolute genius, but we kind of have to understand like where exactly he's coming from in order to talk about Nier. And again, Nier is one of those games that I could talk about for a decade and not run out of things to say, and particularly the soundtrack, but we kind of have to keep things very compressed. So what it's giving us is a lot of extra contextual information. And what we have to look for are the subtle cues. So for starters, when Okabe was writing a lot of this music, he had to write it in multiple iterations. So there has to be one that has like the vocals left in, or there has to be one that's high energy for a boss fight or for a combat encounter, or there has to be one for just exploration, because you're in different biomes and the music has to reflect the action you're doing. It's not just a looping track. There has to flow one into the other. And so he did a lot of this work in Pro Tools to create these different layers and levels of music. So what's really interesting here is that what we have to look out for is othering and informed context. So in other words, what is the game telling us? How is it communicating it to us? And how is the music reinforcing that communication? So let's go ahead and listen to this example from the original soundtrack. This is Memories of Dust.
So here's the same track in a slightly different biome with different context. The rest of it, obviously, you can check it out on your own. Most of you are probably familiar with the soundtrack, but I mean, I love it. So yeah, what differences do we notice there? Because they are different. Purple hair. Yes, please.
The instrumentation's a lot heavier in the second one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And it's also not just heavier, it's adding a bunch of other instruments that are kind of non-standard. So this goes back to that question that was asked earlier. What happens when you have instruments that fundamentally clash, right? Or instruments that we're not necessarily used to. So we have an orchestra that's playing this, but we're also adding a lot of folk percussion to it. We're also adding a lot of folk stringed instruments to it, like for instance, like, you know, guitars, and specifically like very specific types of guitars. But here's another thing. What language is that in?
Yeah, it's not a real language.
It's not a real language.
It's a
actually,
constructed language.
yeah, it's a combination of German and Latin and a bunch of other things. There's, to my knowledge, there's only one other game that does that, and that's Panzer Dragoon Orda. So, like, I bet that doesn't actually mean anything. It's just constructed languages, or I mean, technically, like, I guess you could say that Zelda does it, but like, they don't speak the language, right? It's just, it's part of the written lore of the games. But here, they're actually speaking this language, and this language is sung. So, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that this is exactly what it is. It's an example of othering, right? So, when we listen to a piece of music, the very first thing we focus on is the familiar. We focus, just like in paintings, when we look at a painting, we see the face, we focus on the face. In music, we generally tend to focus on the vocal line and the lyrics. But what happens when the lyrics aren't meant to make sense, right? They're not meant to communicate any kind of meaning. So there's a reason why in Skyrim, the music is usually started, like the lyrics are in English first, and then they go into the language of the Nords, right? Because you're kind of implying or you're inferring the meaning based on what you heard in your native tongue and then transposing it on the second half of that. It's not doing it here, right? So it's just kind of expecting you to decontextualize yourself from everything that's going on. And this just further contributes to how weird and strange and unusual this world is. And this is completely by design, because when Keiji Okabe and Yoko Taro came up with this soundtrack, they're like, hey, let's just, you know, freak these fuckers out and see what happens.
Yeah. If you've ever played this game, everything looks just a little bit familiar and not familiar enough. My favorite scene is when they're in what's clearly like an abandoned library, and there's no books on the shelves, but you know it's supposed to be a library, but it's not a library.
Curiously enough, it's the library from Nier.
Yeah. Everything is just a little bit off. It's familiar enough that you know how this world works, but unfamiliar enough they can put whatever they need to in it to make it work.
Let's wrap it up. So I think probably one of the main reasons I wanted to do this is because video game music is something that we often don't pay attention to. Like, you know, we know that it's there, and, you know, sometimes we're like, oh, cool, yeah, we recognize the Mario theme, we recognize this thing and this thing. But the music is there for a reason. It's not, if it had been written just for the purpose of kind of, you know, wasting our time and filling a spot on the CD or whatever digital media you're downloading from, it's like, it wouldn't have mattered. So the music means something, right? And so what it means is actually is communicating information to us that's really important, somehow filling out those blanks for us, whether giving us contextual information about a particular space or a character or what have you, or giving us some wider context for what the game is actually trying to tell us, like case in point in TIE Fighter. Or in some cases, it's meant to create a mood. It's intended to kind of exegetically draw on that influence to create that sense of otherness. Okay, so how do we apply this analysis? Well, you know, this is something you can also do, like regardless of your expertise in music, this is something you can do, is ask the hard questions, like, why is this music here? What does it mean?
When you boot up Dragon Age Inquisition, don't hit the start button yet and just listen for a second, because it is beautiful and it is telling you things about the disagreement between the Templars and the mages.
Well, why is the hymn to Andraste sounding the way that it does? What is the point of a hymn?
Why is it so awkward when everyone sings that song after Haven?
Right? When Solus gets the Inquisitor and goes like, can I have a word? And I can just in my mind's eye see the Inquisitor goes, oh, thank God. I thought no one would ever explain to me what these fuckers are singing.
Yeah, why is it like that? Why does that scene happen? Why is that music so important in that moment?
The other thing we can do is like engage in structural and reified analysis. Like, we're looking at these things and we're looking at them from the standpoint of like, what does this music mean to us based on our prior experience? Like, for instance, in Star Wars. And then when it changes, why do we react the way we react? And really engage with those questions. Like, for instance, in the commercials for Rise of Skywalker, when they reorchestrated that theme, it really set my teeth on edge as I was listening to it, because I'm like, those are not the right chords. Why am I so mad at this? And then I started asking myself, well, it just turns out that Disney doesn't really know what they're doing with the music, but it's a separate question entirely. And then, of course, like, what does it tell us about the meta narrative? So, like, how does this explain to us what the game is about? Yeah. So that's more or less it. I don't have a better ending for this, so we're just going to take a small bow.
Yes.
And invite you all to come up and ask us some questions.
We have 5 minutes. Real quick, before you run away, this is our contact information. If, 2 weeks from now you're in the shower and you have questions and you're like, I should have asked that, send us a message. These are our QR codes. If you want the bibliography for this talk, so if you want some of the YouTube videos we mentioned, some of the research that we talked about, some of the philosophers that we mentioned, shoot us a message, we'll send you our bibliography.
Yeah. So if anybody
you have
has
a
any
question,
questions,
you
we
have
will
5 minutes. Get
we
up
will
here.
put up a microphone right here. Just come and grab it.
Here, I got it. Because you're going to be answering more. Yes. Hello. Yes. Grab it, talk into it so people can hear you.
Maybe not exactly. Oh, are you okay? Okay, good. That was really cohesive just for being so tired.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. It's the skill of being a professor.
Yeah,
You're exhausted. You still
seriously.
got to teach class.
It was extremely cohesive, but maybe not a question, but more a dialogue. I really love that you brought up Nier Automata. One of my favorite things that I ever heard Yoko Taro talk about was the fact that when he spoke to Keiichi Okabe about the soundtrack, he really he made sure that there were vocals everywhere. And I find that absolutely fascinating because the game is so, in a sense, lifeless. It's obviously post-apocalyptic.
And it deals very much with the questions of what is humanity, what is humanness.
Exactly. So the fact that there are vocals everywhere, especially when you become more engaged with the environments, it's fascinating to me. And I just love that.
This is fundamentally like the most basic instrument, and it's the most intimate instrument, right?
Yeah.
They frequently talk about like how it's the closest thing to our soul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Funny that.
Yeah. So I just love that element, and I thought that tied pretty well into this. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah. If you have another question, if anyone has a question, come down here, speak into the microphone.
I just want to add to that, actually, in go back to music history, instruments were pagan because in the church, the closest thing to God was your voice.
Yes. Yes.
Just to add on to that whole little part of that.
The music history nerd.
That's true. No, it's absolutely, yeah. I couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you guys so much. If you have any other questions, Instagram, social media, or we'll be outside for like 2 minutes.